For decades, Louis Farrakhan has stood at the center of one of the most emotionally charged conversations in modern history: the struggle of Black people to be seen, heard, and treated as fully human. His message has never been about provocation for its own sake, but about confronting pain that many would rather avoid. At the heart of his lifelong mission is a single question that echoes across generations: what did we do to deserve this? Farrakhan speaks from the perspective of a people shaped by centuries of displacement, forced labor, and erased history. When accusations arise that attempt to reduce his voice to controversy, he responds by reframing the conversation around shared humanity. He rejects the idea that acknowledging one group's suffering must come at the expense of another's. Instead, he insists that human pain is not a competition, and that the trauma of slavery and the Middle Passage, which claimed countless lives and shattered entire civilizations, deserves honest recognition. This is not a story about hatred. It is a story about memory, dignity, and survival. It is about how unresolved historical wounds continue to shape economic inequality, cultural misrepresentation, and social division today. Farrakhan's words challenge audiences to look beyond surface narratives and ask deeper questions about power, accountability, and responsibility. In this video, we explore the ideas behind that mission, not to tell you what to think, but to invite you to think more critically about history and its lasting consequences. Whether you agree or disagree, understanding these perspectives is essential to understanding the world we live in now. If you value thoughtful discussions that dig beneath the headlines and bring context to difficult topics, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who enjoys learning beyond the surface. This story is uncomfortable at times, but important stories often are. From that question of shared humanity, Farrakhan's argument moves naturally into the present, where he challenges the way power operates behind the scenes of modern society. If history taught anything, he suggests, it is that injustice rarely announces itself openly. More often, it hides behind laws, policies, and carefully chosen language that shifts blame downward while protecting those at the top. When he speaks about immigration, he does not frame it as a conflict between struggling communities. Instead, he points to a deeper contradiction. The public narrative often focuses on undocumented migrants as the problem, portraying them as a threat or a burden, while ignoring the economic system that quietly depends on their labor. Farrakhan asks listeners to look past the surface and examine who truly benefits. Factories, farms, and service industries continue to operate because low-wage labor keeps costs down and profits high. Yet the individuals doing the work are treated as disposable once political pressure rises. In his telling, this pattern feels painfully familiar. He draws an unspoken line between past and present, reminding audiences that exploitation has always required two elements: vulnerable people and powerful institutions willing to use them. The same logic that once justified forced labor now appears in subtler forms, where corporations relocate production overseas or rely on underpaid workers at home, while responsibility is redirected toward those with the least power to defend themselves. Farrakhan's critique is not about borders alone. It is about accountability. He questions why punishment so often falls on individuals seeking survival, while companies that outsource jobs abandon communities and erode local economies are rarely held to the same standard. Manufacturing towns empty out, livelihoods disappear, and families are left to adapt. Yet the decisions that cause this damage are framed as economic necessity rather than moral choice. By connecting immigration to outsourcing, he reveals a larger story about displacement. Workers are separated from stability, communities from opportunity, and nations from economic sovereignty, all in the name of efficiency and profit. The result is tension between groups who are In reality, caught in the same cycle, Farrakhan warns that when frustration is redirected toward migrants instead of systems, it prevents meaningful change and keeps deeper structures of inequality intact. This perspective reinforces his earlier insistence on shared humanity. Just as he rejects the ranking of historical suffering, he rejects narratives that pit working people against one another. He urges listeners to recognize how easily fear can be used as a distraction, drawing attention away from policies and corporate practices that shape everyday hardship. In his view, true justice requires looking upward rather than sideways, asking hard questions about who writes the rules and who consistently pays the price. Through this lens, immigration becomes another chapter in a much older story. It is a story of labor without protection, profit without responsibility, and voices pushed to the margins while decisions are made far from those affected. Farrakhan's message is clear in its underlying theme. Without confronting the systems that reward exploitation, society risks repeating the same patterns under different names, mistaking the symptom for the cause and leaving the deeper wound untouched. To understand why Farrakhan returns so often to history, it is necessary to see it not as a distant record, but as a living blueprint for the present. After discussing modern systems that shift blame downward and protect power at the top, he reaches back to a moment that, in his view, explains how betrayal can be quietly dressed up as compromise. The year was 1877, and the Civil War had been over for more than a decade. Slavery was legally abolished, and for a brief moment during Reconstruction, Black Americans experienced a fragile sense of possibility. Schools were built, political participation expanded, and the promise of citizenship seemed, at least on paper, within reach. But Farrakhan reminds his audience that progress without protection is easily undone. The compromise of 1877, struck behind closed doors to resolve a disputed presidential election, marked a turning point. Federal troops were withdrawn from the South, not because justice had been achieved, but because national unity and economic stability were prioritized over black lives. With that single political bargain, the safeguards that had restrained violence and exploitation vanished almost overnight. What followed was not a return to chains, but something more subtle and, in many, more enduring. Farrakhan describes how black labor was once again made essential to the economy, especially in agriculture, while black freedom was systematically undermined. Sharecropping replaced plantations, and debt replaced ownership, binding families to land they did not control and profits they would never fully see. The language had changed, but the outcome felt hauntingly familiar: work without security, contribution without reward. In this telling, the Compromise of 1877 is not merely a historical footnote. It is a warning about how easily political deals can erase moral responsibility. Farrakhan connects this betrayal to the patterns already discussed, where institutions preserve themselves by sacrificing those with the least power. Just as modern corporations relocate jobs or exploit vulnerable workers while claiming economic necessity, the nation once justified abandoning Reconstruction in the name of stability and reconciliation. The emotional weight of this moment lies in its silence. There was no national apology, no reckoning with the consequences. Instead, segregation hardened, opportunity narrowed, and violence became a tool of enforcement. Farrakhan argues that this silence allowed exploitation to become normalized, woven into the fabric of law, labor, and social custom. The damage was not only economic but psychological, shaping how generations would come to see their place in society. By linking this past to the present, Farrakhan reinforces his broader theme of continuity. He suggests that systems rarely reinvent themselves. They adapt. What once required open force later relied on policy, economics, and social narratives. The betrayal of 1877 set a precedent, showing how easily progress could be traded away when it threatened established interests. This historical lens deepens his critique of contemporary inequality. It explains why trust in institutions remains fragile and why calls for patience often ring hollow. For Farrakhan, remembering the Compromise of 1877 is not about dwelling on loss, but about recognizing patterns before they repeat yet again. It serves as a reminder that freedom delayed through political calculation can quietly become freedom denied, and that without vigilance, the lessons of history risk being buried beneath the language of compromise and convenience. From the historical betrayal of Reconstruction, Farrakhan's argument moves forward into the everyday reality of economic life, where the legacy of those decisions still quietly operates. He asks listeners to consider a paradox that feels impossible to ignore once it is seen clearly. How can a people with immense collective purchasing power remain economically vulnerable generation after generation? The answer, he suggests, lies not in a lack of effort or ability, but in the direction money flows once it leaves black hands. Farrakhan describes black communities as places of constant economic activity, where money moves daily through rent, food, clothing, entertainment, and services. On the surface, this appears to be evidence of participation and contribution. Yet beneath that movement is a pattern that echoes older systems of extraction. Wealth enters the community, circulates briefly, and then exits almost immediately, accumulating elsewhere. Stores are owned by outsiders, supply chains are controlled elsewhere, and profits are reinvested far from the neighborhoods that generated them. In this way, he connects economics to memory, just as sharecropping once tied labor to land without granting ownership. Modern consumer systems often allow spending without control. Farrakhan does not frame this as an accident, but as a continuation of design. Communities that do not own production, distribution, or decision-making remain dependent, no matter how hard they work or how much they spend. The appearance of participation masks the reality of exclusion. He contrasts this with other groups who arrived in America with little material wealth but quickly prioritized collective economic strategy. Businesses were built, profits were reinvested locally, and institutions followed schools, media, healthcare, and cultural spaces that reinforced independence. Farrakhan emphasizes that this was not magic or privilege alone, but discipline and intentional circulation of money within the community. In comparison, black purchasing power has too often been used to strengthen systems that offer little long-term return. This pattern, he argues, creates a cycle that feels personal but is structural. When businesses disappear, jobs vanish with them. When jobs vanish, frustration grows. That frustration is then misdirected inward or sideways, toward neighbors or other struggling groups, rather than upward toward the mechanisms that drain wealth in the first place. In this sense, economic extraction becomes not only a financial issue but a social one, shaping perceptions of worth, success, and failure. Farrakhan ties this reality back to the earlier betrayals he describes. After the Compromise of 1877, Black Americans were denied access to land, capital, and protection. Over time, this exclusion evolved into subtler forms, where access exists without control and participation without ownership. The result is a modern economy that benefits from black consumption while remaining largely insulated from black influence. Yet his message is not one of despair. By naming the problem, he reframes the conversation from blame to strategy. If money is a form of power, then where it is spent and how long it stays matter deeply. Farrakhan urges a shift in consciousness, from individual survival to collective planning, from short-term convenience to long-term stability. He insists that wealth is not only what is earned, but what is retained, multiplied, and passed on. In this broader narrative, economic self-determination becomes a form of dignity. It is a way of breaking patterns that stretch back generations. of transforming participation into ownership and consumption into investment. Farrakhan's argument fits seamlessly into his larger vision. History explains the present, but awareness creates the possibility of a different future, one where the flow of wealth finally reflects the value of the people who generate it. Building on the patterns of extraction and lost ownership, Farrakhan turns attention to another quiet mechanism that weakened economic independence over time: exclusion from skilled trades and labor unions. He frames this not as a sudden collapse, but as a gradual closing of doors that once stood open. In earlier generations, skill was inheritance. A father passed knowledge to a son, an uncle taught a trade, and hands-on expertise became a form of security that could not easily be taken away. Carpentry, masonry, metalwork, and mechanical skills were more than jobs. They were pathways to stability and pride. Farrakhan explains that this continuity was disrupted when access to organized labor and training was deliberately restricted. Unions that claimed to protect workers often defined protection narrowly, deciding who belonged and who did not. Black workers, once essential in building railroads, cities, and infrastructure, found themselves edged out as rules changed and membership became a gatekeeper. Immigration policies and labor agreements opened opportunities for some while quietly pushing others aside, reshaping the workforce without ever acknowledging who was being displaced. This exclusion had consequences far beyond employment. When skilled work is denied, so is the ability to teach it forward. Generational knowledge breaks, and with it, the confidence that comes from self-reliance. Farrakhan connects this loss directly to the broader economic story he has already told. Without access to trades, communities are forced to rely on external services. Without ownership of skills, money leaves the neighborhood to pay someone else to build, repair, or create. What appears as a labor issue becomes another channel through which wealth drains away. He presents this as a form of dependency carefully normalized over time. Young people grow up without seeing craftsmen who look like them, without mentors who can show that skill leads to ownership. Instead, they are taught to pursue limited paths that rarely include control over production. Farrakhan does not dismiss education or professional careers, but he warns against abandoning practical skill entirely. A society that cannot build, repair, or maintain itself becomes vulnerable, no matter how much it consumes. This critique ties back to the historical betrayals he has already outlined. After Reconstruction, black labor was needed, but black advancement was not protected. Over time, this imbalance evolved into systems that extracted work while restricting advancement. Exclusion from unions mirrored exclusion from land, capital, and political power. Each reinforced the other, creating a web that made independence increasingly difficult to sustain. Farrakhan's storytelling here is rooted in contrast. He points to communities that guarded their trades, ensuring that skills stayed within families and neighborhoods. Those skills became businesses, and those businesses became institutions. The result was continuity, a sense that each generation stood on the shoulders of the last. In contrast, black communities were repeatedly reset, forced to start over without tools that should have been passed down. Yet, as with his other arguments, he does not stop at diagnosis. By naming what was lost, he implies what can be rebuilt. Skills can be learned again, trades reclaimed, and knowledge shared intentionally. Farrakhan frames this not as nostalgia, but as strategy. Economic freedom, he insists, is not only about money in the bank, but about capability in the hands. In the larger narrative, exclusion from trades is another thread in the same fabric of control. It explains why purchasing power alone has not translated into independence and why wealth remains fragile without production. Farrakhan's message remains consistent. History did not simply happen to black communities. It shaped their options. Understanding how those options were narrowed is the first step toward expanding them again, restoring not only income, but dignity, confidence, and generational strength. After tracing the long arc of betrayal, exclusion, and economic drain, Farrakhan turns toward what he sees as the only path that can break the cycle. Unity rooted not in ideology, but in shared necessity. He recognizes that division has always been one of the most effective tools used against marginalized communities, especially when differences in religion, politics, or organizational loyalty are elevated above common interests. In his telling, fragmentation is not accidental. It is encouraged because it keeps people debating identity while their collective needs remain unmet. Farrakhan speaks to audiences made up of many beliefs and affiliations, yet he deliberately shifts the focus away from labels. He argues that while faith, culture, and organizations matter, they cannot become barriers to cooperation. Hunger, housing, education, safety, and economic stability do not belong to one religion or one group. They are shared realities, and ignoring that truth allows long-standing problems to persist under new names. This call for unity is not sentimental. It is practical, having already shown how wealth leaves black communities, how skills were stripped away, and how labor was exploited without ownership. Farrakhan frames cooperation as a form of strategy rather than symbolism. A divided community spends its energy debating who leads and who belongs, while a unified one concentrates on what must be built. In this sense, unity becomes a tool of self-defense against systems that thrive on disorganization. He emphasizes that self-reliance does not require uniformity of belief. People can pray differently, organize differently, and still work together economically. Farrakhan challenges the idea that cooperation demands conversion or conformity. Instead, he proposes a baseline agreement, recognition of shared struggle and shared responsibility. Once that agreement exists, collective action becomes possible without erasing individuality. This perspective ties directly back to the earlier themes of ownership and control. Without unity, efforts to build businesses, reclaim skills, or circulate wealth collapse under competition and mistrust. Farrakhan suggests that internal conflict often mirrors external pressure. When resources are scarce and opportunity limited, people turn inward, blaming one another rather than questioning the structure that produced the scarcity in the first place. Unity interrupts that pattern by redirecting attention towards solutions instead of disputes. He also addresses skepticism directly, acknowledging that disagreement is inevitable. Unity, in his view, does not mean silence or blind agreement. It means refusing to let disagreement stop progress. Farrakhan frames this as maturity, the ability to prioritize long-term survival over short-term victory in arguments. Communities that cannot move forward together, he warns, remain easy to manipulate and slow to recover. Within the broader narrative, this call acts as a turning point, after laying out the damage done by historical compromise. Economic extraction and institutional exclusion. Farrakhan offers unity as the connective force that can reverse those outcomes. Shared effort allows skills to be taught again, businesses to be supported intentionally, and wealth to circulate with purpose. Without unity, even the best plans remain isolated attempts rather than sustained movements. He presents unity as a return to something fundamental rather than a new invention. Families once relied on each other, neighborhoods pooled resources, and collective survival was understood as common sense. Farrakhan argues that reclaiming this mindset does not require permission from institutions or validation from outside forces. It begins with recognizing that strength grows when people stop waiting to be included and start building together. In this way, unity becomes the bridge between understanding history and shaping the future. It transforms awareness into action and memory into motivation. Farrakhan's message is clear in its direction. Differences may shape identity, but shared needs define destiny. and only collective self-reliance can turn that destiny into something lasting. As the story reaches its conclusion, Farrakhan brings every thread together into a single, unmistakable message. Freedom without economic control is fragile, and dignity without ownership is easily taken away. After examining history, betrayal, exclusion, and division, he points to economic empowerment as the foundation upon which everything else must stand. Not as a slogan, but as a discipline. Not as a dream, but as a responsibility. He emphasizes that talent alone is not power if it is managed, packaged, and profited from by others. Across music, sports, film, and culture, Black creativity has shaped global influence. Yet the systems that control production and distribution rarely belong to the communities that generate that value. Farrakhan frames this as a modern form of dependency, participation without authority, visibility without control. True empowerment, he argues, begins when talent is paired with ownership and long-term vision. From there, the focus widens to everyday economic choices. Supporting Black-owned businesses is not presented as symbolic loyalty, but as a strategic act. Each purchase becomes a vote, each dollar a tool, when money circulates within the community paying workers. Funding expansion. Supporting families, it multiplies its impact. When it immediately exits, it leaves behind consumption without stability. Farrakhan insists that freedom grows where money is allowed to stay, move, and build. He speaks of circulation as a lifeline. $1 passing through multiple hands within the same community strengthens infrastructure, confidence, and opportunity. It creates jobs, sustains institutions, and makes future planning possible. Without this circulation, communities remain dependent on external systems that have historically failed to protect their interests. Economic empowerment, in this sense, is not exclusionary. It is protective. This vision reframes freedom itself. Farrakhan challenges the idea that freedom is merely legal status or public recognition. Instead, he defines it as the ability to provide for oneself, to shape one's own narrative, and to pass something meaningful to the next generation. Economic control becomes the bridge between survival and self-determination, between reacting to injustice and building beyond it. The conclusion is not delivered with despair, but with urgency and belief. Farrakhan does not deny the scale of the challenge, yet he refuses to treat it as impossible. Talent exists. Money exists. Creativity exists. What has been missing, he argues, is coordinated control and collective intent. Once those align, progress becomes sustainable rather than temporary. As this story comes to an end, its core message remains clear. History explains how the struggle began, but choice determines how it continues. Economic empowerment is not the final step, it is the starting point for lasting change. Thank you for taking the time to listen, reflect, and engage with this story. If you found value in this exploration and want more thoughtful, in-depth narratives that connect history, economics, and culture, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps keep these conversations alive and moving forward.